Thanks for everybody coming tonight. And we have a green light. We have audio. Yay. Is yours on?
I think so. Am I good?
Yep.
Great.
So I'm going to do an informal prospectus, then I'll do a formal introduction, and then we'll go. Next week, before we get to next week, this Sunday at 3 p.m. right here, next Sunday, this Sunday, February 5th, at 3 p.m. right here, we're going to have a special Sunday edition of Wednesday Night at the Lab with the Friends of the Lakeshore Nature Preserve. And Ben Giuliano from Entomology is going to speak with us about predator insects and wasps, their role and benefits. So, if you'd like to get some entomology with your etymology, come on down. Sunday at 3. Doors will be open, I hope. I asked the security folks to open the doors today, unlock them. Does everybody know what Lakeshore Nature Preserve is? About 330 acres on the 930-acre campus. And the Friends of the Lakeshore Nature Preserve is the Friends organization that supports that part of the university. Next week, John Hawks from Anthropology will be here with a special Darwin Days presentation. The title of his talk is Finding Other Ancient Minds Across the Human Evolutionary Tree. I think he'll be talking a little bit about Homo naledi and some other hominin species. On February 15th, Francisco Pellegrini from Genetics here will be talking about preserving biodiversity for the future and some of the fundamental research he's doing on embryology and cool stuff like that that might be helpful to preserving biodiversity. All right, yay. Senderovich.
Just like it's spelled.
I have to get it in my mind, though.
I tell people it's like send her over, like that cadence, like send her over. Yeah.
All right. It's like a mnemonic device. Welcome, everyone, to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Lee Senderovich. She's with two departments, the Department of Gender and Women's Studies and the Department of OBGYN, Obstetrics and Gynecology. I know them only by the letters. Today, she's going to talk with us about I Was Obligated to Accept Coercion and Autonomy in Contemporary Global Family Planning. Lee, I get to ask you the 5 questions I ask everybody. The standard line is you can answer the questions any way you'd like. The answers don't have to be true, they just have to be believable. Lee, where were you born?
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And where'd you go to high school?
Masterman High School.
Is that in Philadelphia?
In Philadelphia, yes.
And where'd you go for your undergrad and what did you study?
I studied anthropology and gender studies at Wesleyan University in Connecticut.
And what town is that in Wesleyan?
Middletown, Connecticut.
Middletown, thank you. And then where'd you go for your advanced degrees and what did you study?
I got my Master's of Public Health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and then I got my Doctor of Science degree in Global Health and Population from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health.
Good, and then you came here for a postdoc, or
Yeah.
did you do other postdocs?
I did my one and only postdoc here. I was a Health Disparities Research Scholar, which is an NIH-funded postdoc in the Department of OBGYN, Obstetrics and Gynecology.
Very good. And when did you get to start your faculty position?
I'm brand new. I just started this academic year.
Excellent. I'm delighted to have you here. My wife is a demographer who's worked on areas similar to yours. This is going to be interesting to hear what you have to say. Would you please join me in welcoming Lee Senderovich to Wednesday Night at the Lab? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you all so much for coming. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share a little bit about my work on coercion and autonomy in global family planning. So, you have a little bit of background about me, but I guess maybe I just want to share a little bit more about me. You can tell I have sort of like a weird appointment here, partly in the med school in OBGYN and partly in gender and women's studies. We don't often have a lot of cross-pollination between those two worlds, but that's really where I sit, as sort of doing critical feminist work on global reproductive health. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And I'm really delighted that you all were able to come and join us. So this is just a little roadmap of where we'll be going today. I'm going to spend, I think, a big chunk of time on this background on coercion in family planning programs. I'll spend a little bit of time on what I call the tacit ideology of family planning measurement. I'll spend another big chunk of time on my main study, my Contraceptive Autonomy Study, and then spend a little bit of time just on where I think we should go next. So let's start with some background and rationale. And I always like to start with the question, why should we even bother to care about family planning? Why are we even talking about this? And what I love about family planning is that different people have really different answers to that question. There are a lot of different reasons that bring people together to care about family planning. Another set of demographers at one point called the folks who care about family planning strange bedmates, because it brings together people that you wouldn't necessarily assume to be allies. And so we have certainly a feminist rationale for family planning, believing contraception to be a matter of rights and autonomy. An environmentalist rationale for family planning, that if we have fewer people on the planet Earth, we can alleviate climate change and protect biodiversity. There's an economic rationale for family planning, that we can reduce poverty and promote economic growth through contraceptive use. And then, of course, a public health rationale, that fewer children can improve both maternal and child health. And so this is a screenshot from a family planning advocacy website that shows how several of these arguments can be deployed at once. They frame family planning as, quote, the smartest investment we can make. And I think this type might be a little bit small, but hopefully when I highlight things, you can see that they talk about family planning as a way to prevent HIV/AIDS, to improve outcomes in education, to improve things like water and sanitation, to improve outcomes in things like malaria, as well as bringing significant savings across sectors. And so in this way, family planning is really portrayed as almost a silver bullet for the multidimensional challenges of poor health, global poverty, and unsafe living conditions. And so with so much upside and almost no stated downside, the challenge for family planning folks has been framed as how can we promote contraceptive uptake to its highest levels possible. But of course, we really need to remember too that despite all of these purported benefits that family planning can have, it hasn't always been an emancipatory project for all people since its inception. Rather, family planning has been intertwined with a range of efforts to control both fertility overall, as well as to decide whose bodies are targeted for fertility reduction. And so in the United States, the eugenics movement targeted the bodies of minoritized racial and ethnic groups, disabled people, people living in poverty, among others, for compulsory sterilization. This is a photo of civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer, who, in addition to being known for her civil rights and voting rights work, helped to popularize the term Mississippi appendectomy, which was a slang term that Black women in the US South used to describe their involuntary sterilization at the hands of white doctors. And this actually happened to Ms. Hamer herself. She was given a non-consented radical hysterectomy by a white doctor while she was undergoing surgery for a small tumor in 1961. The reproductive justice framework was developed by Black women in the mid-1990s to highlight the deficiency of white feminist paradigms to address the intersecting challenges of racism and misogyny and other forms of structural oppression and how those affected their reproductive health. Oops, look what I did here. So on the right here, you have a photo of Loretta Ross. She's one of the original signatories of this open letter that you can see on the left. This was a letter to Congress that they published in the Washington Post in August of 1994, and is considered the founding document of the reproductive justice movement. So among other things, this letter demands equal access to health services and protection from discrimination. There we go. So these same Black feminist scholars and activists later more fully elaborated the reproductive justice framework to include 3 core values. These 3 core values are the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent your children in healthy and safe environments. The reproductive justice framework includes a focus on structural factors that impede reproductive freedom, and it uses an explicitly intersectional lens that centers the experiences of the most marginalized. And so I think what I want to emphasize here about reproductive justice is this is really sort of a transformative and liberatory framework for reproductive health that's been increasingly influential here in the US, but this framework has not been nearly widely applied to family planning programs in the Global South. So let's actually turn our attention to the Global South right now, because after the Second World War, neo-Malthusian concerns about global overpopulation were really central to the birth of the international development sector. So the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, was founded in 1961, and that very same year that it was founded, it began funding research into family planning as one of its very first activities. This timeline, the type might be a little bit small for you again, but this is a screenshot from the USAID family planning website. And you can see here how Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon all motivated US development assistance for global family planning as a way to control global overpopulation with a focus on poor countries. President Johnson said that he would seek new ways to use our knowledge to help deal with the explosion in world population and the growing scarcity of world resources. And President Nixon called population growth, quote, one of the most serious challenges to human destiny. So let that sink in for a second. One of the most serious challenges to human destiny. These are very grave stakes, right? This is not something to mess around with. So given these stark and apocalyptic stakes, the legitimacy of coercion in the pursuit of fertility decline was frequently affirmed throughout this population control era. In 1979, the president of a very influential organization called the Population Council published a paper advocating for what he called a stepladder approach to dealing with the so-called population problem. So this is a guy named Bernard Berelson. He wrote in 1979 that, quote, there are undoubtedly cases of justified coercion, but he cautioned that, quote, overt violence or other potentially injurious coercion is not to be used before non-injurious coercion has been exhausted. So you get a sense here of what folks' priorities are. During this time, many countries in the Global South adopted population policies aimed at reducing fertility. These included things like economic penalties for high fertility, recruitment quotas for family planning providers, and compulsory sterilization for women. For example, Singapore, whose family planning messaging you can see here on the right, there were financial penalties leveled at families who had more than 2 children. And in India, actually to this day, this picture is not that old, there are still financial payments and other incentives for women who get sterilized. And sort of the sooner you get sterilized with fewer children, the more money your incentive is, and the more children you have, sort of the more attenuated the amount of money you get for undergoing sterilization becomes. Of course, feminist scholars have pushed back, not just scholars, activists too, have really pushed back against this. It's not that this has gone uncontested. And feminists around the world have really organized to oppose the types of reproductive violence that were being perpetrated in the name of population control. So here you have a poster from a San Francisco-based artist named Rachel Romero, who created this image in 1977 to contest the forced sterilizations that were going on in California at the time. So this wasn't just happening in the Global South, but certainly very much here in the US as well. So all of this came to a head in 1994. This is like a big year for family planning. This is a watershed moment. This is the year that the United Nations organized the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. And this conference became the well-known reckoning where a substantial and well-organized feminist opposition really confronted the population control movement and demanded an end to coercive family planning. So this is the conventional wisdom. This is to quote an article from The Lancet. The Cairo conference put the ideas of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights, choice, women's empowerment, a life cycle approach, and gender equity at the center of the international agenda and signaled the end of the so-called population era. So we have this, this sort of conventional wisdom, this claim that the Cairo conference really changed everything. And we have what many call the post-Cairo shift, in which the focus on population control and demographic targets is supposed to be replaced by this much more holistic focus on reproductive, there we go. Is supposed to be replaced by a much more holistic focus on reproductive health, gender equity, quality of care, and rights. It's my contention, however, that this post-Cairo shift has been much more successful as a rhetorical move in terms of changing what we talk about than it has been substantively in terms of changing what we do. And I argue that the orientation towards fertility reduction still remains very much intact in global family planning programs today. And here I'll just scroll through very quickly some examples of state-sanctioned contraceptive coercion in the years since Cairo. So there have been efforts to control fertility overall, like the very well-known one-child policy in China that was in effect until 2016. Or these sterilization camps in India that were also run all the way through 2016. There have been efforts that focused on controlling the fertility of ethnic minorities, like this example from Peru, where indigenous women were targeted until the year 2000. There have been efforts to target people living with HIV, like this example from Namibia from 2012. Efforts to control the fertility of women of color and particularly women of African descent, like this example from Israel from 2013. There have been efforts to control the fertility of trans people, like this example from Europe from 2017. Efforts to control the fertility of poor people, like this example from Australia from 2014. Efforts to control the fertility of people with both physical and intellectual disabilities. This is an example of intellectual disabilities from a few years ago in the United Kingdom, 2015, I believe. And from right here in the US, we have our pick of examples. This is just one. This is an example where incarcerated people were targeted, where a judge offered to shorten the jail sentences of people who agreed to adopt either a long-acting or permanent method of contraception. And so here you have examples of contemporary contraceptive coercion from every inhabited continent in the world, targeting just about every type of marginalized group you can think of across axes of race, ethnicity, gender, disability, class, geography, and more. So if we think about every single type of oppression we can think of, we're stratifying reproduction along those lines as well. Of course, these like headline-making cases of rights abuses are a pretty far cry from how most mainstream family planning programs operate day to day. And it's really important for us to note that virtually all mainstream family planning programs have denounced these types of overtly coercive practices, and they take a lot of care to affirm the importance of voluntarism in their program. So we hear a lot of talk in mainstream family planning about voluntary family planning, and there's a big emphasis on wanting to avoid overt coercion. And so I think it'd be easy to dismiss those types of, the cases that I just showed as outliers, maybe the result of a few rogue providers or perhaps some out-of-touch bureaucrats, but not really related to the sort of the fundamental core of global family planning today. But what I argue is that this reality of stratified reproduction and the ideological focus on fertility reduction really does remain woven into the heart of global family planning today. And I think you can see that if you look particularly at our research agenda in the family planning field. So let's look for a second at what I call the tacit ideology of measurement. And we have another small type problem again, but this is a screenshot from the Bulletin of the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, the WHO, convened a meeting of global family planning experts to conduct a priority setting exercise for family planning research. And so they got family planning experts together in a room to conduct an exercise of agenda setting. What's the most important thing for us to study in the next few years? And let's look at the priorities that they arrived at. And I'll read these out to you because I know the type looks small. So the first priority is to identify the main barriers to uptake. The second priority is to improve uptake. The third priority is to increase uptake. And the fourth priority is to identify effective strategies to overcome barriers to uptake. I'm glossing over a little bit of nuance here. Some of these are focused on the postpartum period. Some of them are focused on integration of family planning with HIV services. But the outcome, the end goal that they're looking for, the top 4 priorities for the next few years, all have to do with increasing contraceptive uptake. And so looking at what our measurement priorities are is like a really good window into understanding what the broader community priorities are. We measure what we care about, and we care about what we measure, right? So I love this quote from an anthropologist named Sally Engel Mary from her book called The Seductions of Quantification. And Mary tells us that statistical knowledge is often viewed as non-political by its creators. It flies under the radar it flies under the radar of social and political analysis as a form of power. Yet how such numerical assessments are created, produced, cast into the world, and used has significant implications for the way the world is understood and governed. So although our indicators and what we measure, these might seem like just objective counts of any given phenomenon, what we choose to count, and particularly how we choose to count those things, these are political decisions that reflect the political worldviews of the people who are making them. And so the thing that I do in my work a lot is I spend a lot of time thinking through what are the tacit ideologies of our family planning measurement? What type of power are these measures wielding? And whose worldview do these indicators help us understand? And more importantly, whose worldview do these indicators obscure? So let's think back to that focus on uptake. What is it telling us? And what don't we understand when we focus so narrowly on uptake measures? Bless you. So here's a list of some of the most common population-based indicators that we use in global family planning today. So we have the total fertility rate. This is a synthetic cohort measure that roughly gives us an idea of how many children a woman would have if she went through her entire reproductive years subjected to the prevailing fertility rates of that time. So no one really has that many kids, but it gives us a sense of sort of overall fertility patterns. So we're measuring fertility. We're measuring contraceptive prevalence rate. That's just the percentage of people in a population who are using contraception. We have a measure called unmet need for contraception that I'm not going to get into now. It's extremely complex. If you want to take my word for it, it's not a good measure. And it seems like it's measuring some sort of need for contraception that is unmet, but it's misnamed. That's not what it's doing. It's measuring fertility and contraceptive use. We have age-specific focuses on fertility, so we measure an adolescent fertility rate. Sometimes we'll measure a contraceptive prevalence rate that's focused specifically on what we call modern methods. So we'll exclude things like withdrawal or periodic abstinence or lactational amenorrhea like breastfeeding. We'll exclude those and we'll focus on biomedical methods. And we call that the modern contraceptive prevalence rate. And then we have a new measure that we're using for the Sustainable Development Goals called the proportion of need met by modern methods. But what's really interesting to understand from this list of measures is that the only thing that's being measured here are fertility outcomes and contraceptive uptake. Nowhere in any of these measures is a health outcome. None of these is measuring health. None of these is measuring reproductive rights. None of these gives us a sense of access. None of these is telling us anything about health equity. We're still really squarely focused on that pre-Cairo agenda, right? Demographic targets, fertility decline, as opposed to this post-Cairo agenda of reproductive rights, gender equity, quality of care. So what I argue is that while our motivations for family planning might have been radically transformed in the years since Cairo, our measurements haven't followed suit. And that's resulted in this really fundamental misalignment between what we say we care about on the one hand and how we measure and track success towards those goals on the other hand. Now, this fundamental misalignment between our measures and our goals, it's not just a question of academic interest, but it has really fundamental implications for how programs get funded, how they get designed, how they're implemented, and how they're evaluated. This is particularly true in the global health world, where the importance of a discrete set of quantitative indicators for target setting can hardly be overstated. So for those of you who are familiar with the Millennium Development Goals or the Sustainable Development Goals, those are examples of how we use quantitative indicators in global health to develop targets, which in turn guide our programs. And this is particularly true in family planning. We've actually seen an increased reliance on quantitative target setting in the past decade. Excuse me one second. Excuse me. Some of you may be familiar with this initiative called the Family Planning 2020 Initiative, or FP 2020. This was a global initiative began in 2012, funded in large part by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the program's main objective was to reach this quantitative target to add 120 million additional users of modern contraceptive methods by 2020 in the world's poorest countries. And in the words of the program's architects, the success of FP 2020 will first be evaluated on the basis of quantitative verification to determine that the 120 by 20 goal was met. Or was it, what does it say? Was reached. That overarching goal of 120 million new users of contraception in 8 years spawned a range of regional and national goals that were pursued and measured in much the same way. So both individual countries as well as regional initiatives ended up making formal commitments to FP 2020, pledging to meet certain targets for contraceptive uptake. So this is an example from the Ouagadougou Partnership, which is a regional initiative comprised of 9 countries from Francophone West Africa, including Benin, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. And together, these 9 countries pledged to add a combined 2.2 million new users of family planning across those 9 countries by the year 2020. And so we have these regional initiatives, and then we also have individual countries that are making commitments to this initiative in much the same way. So here you can see some excerpts from Ghana's FP 2020 commitment. This includes both an aim to increase modern contraceptive prevalence from 22% to 30% among married women, and from 32% to 40% among unmarried women. And they also had a goal pulled from a pre-existing population policy to reduce total fertility from 5.5 children to 3 children. So increase contraception and reduce the number of children per woman. Some governments set even more specific goals than that. This is a screenshot from the Burkina Faso National Plan to Accelerate Family Planning. This is in French. I'm just going to translate it here for you into English. And as you can see, the government set not only an overall target of getting contraceptive prevalence up to 32% by the year 2020, but they also set method-specific targets about how they wanted to get there. So this plan for increasing modern contraceptive prevalence focuses specifically on promoting the use of long-acting and medium-acting methods with a focus on injectables, implants, and IUDs. So the government is really setting very specific targets for, like, this is how many new IUD users we need this year. This is how many new implant users we need. This is how many new injectable users we need. And so it's this global context for family planning that led to the 2 overarching research questions that keep me up at night and really guide my work. The first is, what happens to people's experiences if and when it's fertility goals rather than reproductive health and rights that drive family planning programs? And the second question is, how can we design family planning indicators that measure and promote this post-Cairo agenda of reproductive health and autonomy and move us away from this pre-Cairo focus on demographic targets and fertility decline? So these are the questions that inspired the Contraceptive Autonomy Study. The goals of this study are to better understand how contraceptive coercion manifests, and how we can build a fundamentally new approach to global family planning measurement that promotes person-centered care and promotes reproductive freedom. And so we'll spend the rest of our time together tonight on this. Just a brief background on methods. I'm not going to spend too long here. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about our methods. But generally, this is an exploratory sequential mixed method study that used first a formative qualitative phase to inform the development and implementation of a large-scale quantitative survey. I'm not going to mention the name of the country where we did the work today. That's been anonymized. But it is a country that has won international acclaim for its family planning program in recent years. And the idea is that if coercion has been found in this highly visible and award-winning program, it's reasonable to hypothesize that coercion might be a similar problem throughout similarly conceived family planning programs. So in terms of our mixed methods, our qualitative phase consisted of in-depth interviews with women of reproductive age, focus group discussions, and key informant interviews with health administrators. This qualitative phase helped us understand what kind of experiences people were having, what type of language they used to describe those experiences, and that in turn helped us sort of craft new survey questions that would make sense given those experiences. So then we used data from that phase to develop this novel survey questionnaire, which we conducted at 2 different research sites among over 3,900 women of reproductive age. I'm going to do a brief overview of our qualitative findings, and then I'll go on to how we're using those findings to help us develop a new measure of contraceptive autonomy. So the main thing to come out of our qualitative phase is what I call a comprehensive theory of coercion. And this theory of coercion has 3 main components. The first is that coercion is not necessarily a binary outcome, yes or no, yes total coercion or no coercion at all, but rather sits on a spectrum. The second tenet of this theory is that coercion can be structural, not just interpersonal. And the third tenet of this theory is that coercion doesn't just go one way, but it actually goes in 2 separate directions. So let's start with this idea of coercion sitting on a spectrum. This is, I think, maybe perhaps one of the key findings of this work. We generally tend to think of coercion as a binary outcome. Like yes, I was coerced, or no, there was no coercion at all. But I think that binary thinking really obscures the wide array of means through which coercion can manifest. So we have this spectrum ranging from subtle coercion to overt coercion. And on the subtler end, we have things like very limited method mix, biased or directive contraceptive counseling, the provision of false medical information to try to convince someone to adopt a method. In terms of moderate coercion, we have things like threats to deny future care, scare tactics, and insisting until a person accepts, going to their home or their place of work, for example, is something that came up in our work. And then on the more overt end, we have things like refusing to remove a long-acting method like an IUD or an implant on request, and also inserting those types of methods without a person's knowledge or consent. So let's look at some examples of this. And this is an example of what we're calling subtle coercion. This is Maria's story. We asked Maria to tell us about her contraceptive counseling, and Maria tells us, well, the health workers normally counsel you that if you want to choose, you have to choose the 5 years, by which she means the contraceptive implant. Now, if that method isn't suitable for you, you can take it out and get the 3 months, by which she means the injectables. But if you don't like that, you can't take it out. You have to wait for the 3 months to be over. Otherwise, you can't remove it. The interviewer asks, so it's the providers who told you? Maria responds, it's true that there's counseling. They tell you to choose what you like. But what they think is best, it's only the 5 years, the implant. So I've called this type of biased and directive counseling subtle coercion. There's no use of threats or violence here, right? And Maria is actually using the language of choice to describe it. But it's also clear that Maria is describing a situation in which autonomy to choose which family planning method or no family planning method at all is restricted by the biases of the provider. And now here's an example from our in-depth interviews of what we're calling overt coercion. This is Jessica's story. And Jessica tells us, when I got pregnant with my 10th child, the midwife told me I have a lot of children and that I would have a difficult delivery. The health workers in a nearby town said that I needed to get the implant by force. I was obligated to accept, and they gave me the implant. The nurse told me that it would be 5 years, And even before the date of the 5th year, I started to feel illnesses due to the implant. I went to tell the hospital that I got headaches from the implant, and it's there that the health worker told me that the date to remove it hasn't yet arrived, so he can't remove it. Oops, I have a little bit of a formatting thing here, but it says he refused. He said that it hasn't yet been 5 years, and there are 2 months that still remain. There's a lot going on here with Jessica. I'm gonna just focus on a few key things. First, Jessica was forced to get an implant due to a provider's perception that she had too many children. It doesn't seem that Jessica was given any choice, A, about whether or not to use contraception at all, and B, about what method she was provided. And then instead of viewing the 5-year duration of the contraceptive implant as the maximum period of efficacy, which is the intended use of that 5-year window, many, many women told us very similar stories of providers treating that 5-year period as the minimum duration of use, refusing to take the implants out before that time had completely elapsed. So in this case, the provider, we can see, is very clearly forcing Jessica to use a method that she wants to discontinue because the provider feels like there are still 2 months of sort of good medicine in that implant that they don't want to waste. Here's an advantage of what I'm calling structural coercion. So we spoke to a health administrator, and this person's job is to go from clinic to clinic as a supervisor and meet with the midwives and the nurses and tell them, like, you're doing a great job, keep up the good work, or B, you're not doing such a great job. And so we asked the supervisor how they do that work, and they said to us, at the district level, we also give goals to each health center so that they can attain the targets. Those that are concerned with all the methods mixed together, but above all, the long-acting methods that we're really emphasizing. And so I think this quote's really helpful because it helps us to gain an understanding of contraceptive coercion as something that's structural, that's stemming from policies and programs, as opposed to something that's a result of a few bad apples or because of some ill intent or malice on the part of a provider. In much of the thinking around the coercion, we do tend to focus on this intent or blame individual providers for being biased or providing poor quality of care. But I think that focus on individual providers has distracted us from looking at the root causes of coercion. So I argue that instead of blaming providers, if we try to understand coercion as something that stems from the policies that we've put in place and the programs that we've implemented, we can help reframe the situation and place the critique on the donors and the program designers from the global north. These systems were designed really with the express goal of achieving high contraceptive uptake. Think back to our WHO research priorities. Uptake, 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 right? Those are our priorities. It should then come as little surprise to us when rights and autonomy are subordinated to that goal of achieving these contraceptive uptake targets. And then finally, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but I wanted to note that this little schematic helps to demonstrate what I mean when I talk about the bidirectionality of coercion. Both of those examples from both Maria and Jessica do a good job of showing what I call upward coercion. This is when someone has a contraceptive method foisted on them that they don't want. But that's not the only type of coercion. There's another really important form of coercion in which someone is denied a method that they do want. And we don't normally think of that as coercion. When someone's sent away from a health center without contraceptive method, we haven't historically considered that a form of coercion yet. But I argue that it's the mirror image, it's almost identical to the type of upward coercion that we're familiar with, insofar as a person's autonomy to decide for themselves whether they want to use contraception is denied. So this I think, is a really important element of this theory because it helps us remember that the problem is not that family planning programs are bad writ large, but rather they're bad when people's needs are not met, and that's either their need not to use a contraceptive method or their need to use a contraceptive method. So bringing all together these three ideas, my theory of coercion rests on the contention that all obstructions to contraceptive autonomy, upward and downward, structural and interpersonal, subtle and overt, should all be understood and analyzed as various iterations of the same process, which is coercion. But so now comes the really hard part, which is how do we design novel survey questions and a new quantitative indicator to help us measure this now nuanced understanding of coercion. So I'm going to go quickly here because I don't want to keep you here all night. But we know we have to do something pretty different from the status quo. So for most of recent history, the outcome of interest to the family planning community has been really straightforward. We've been measuring contraceptive use. That's what we've cared about. And we can define this in a pretty straightforward way, which is when a person is using a method, that's a good outcome. And when a person's not using a method, that's a bad outcome. That's how all of our family planning measures are structured. But if we add just one more dimension to what we measure, and also examine the extent to which a person wants a family planning method, we can begin to create a more person-centered understanding of family planning. So I ask, if we add this second criterion, is the column to the right still always good? And is the column to the left still always bad? I suggest a new definition of success for family planning that's not dependent on the person's status as a contraceptive user or non-user, but rather on concordance between what the person wants and what they have. And so it's based on this concordance that I propose a new measure of contraceptive autonomy. But here's the really hard part. What does it actually mean to want something? And especially when we think about autonomy, we know that actually a lot more goes into decision-making than just what you feel. Do you have resources? Do you have access? Are you empowered? There are a million things that go into wanting something and being able to realize that. So we actually define contraceptive autonomy as the factors that are necessary for a person to decide for themselves what they want in relation to contraception and then to realize that decision. And we have another little formatting snafu here, but I hope you can still read that we divided the concept of contraceptive autonomy into 3 categories of informed choice, full choice, and free choice, where informed choice is a decision based on sufficient, unbiased information about a range of family planning options, including both the benefits and the risks of contraceptive use and non-use. Full choice is a decision made with access to a sufficiently wide range of methods from which to choose. And a decision made about what, free choice is a decision made about whether or not to use contraception and what method to use, made voluntarily without barriers or coercion. And I'll note here that these definitions are adapted from a previous work by Charlotte Feldman Jacobs and Karen Newman. So if we go back now to our contingency tables, now we can start thinking through who goes into which table. So in box A are people who made a free, full, and informed decision not to use family planning. In box B, we have people who have a family planning method, but did not have information, access, or freedom in that choice. Box C are people who do not use family planning, but did not make a free, full, or informed choice not to use. And box D, we have people who made a free, full, and informed decision to use a family planning method. And then using the schematic, now we can start to develop our indicators. So the main indicator that I propose based on this schematic is the contraceptive autonomy score. This is pretty simple. It's just the proportion of people who have contraceptive autonomy over the population as a whole. This might not seem that groundbreaking, but it's the first family planning indicator that I know of, to my knowledge, that gives a program credit for respecting someone's choice not to use family planning. So if you think about the example of a coerced IUD. Let's think about that example. In our traditional measurement approach, the IUD is measured and it looks good on paper, and the coercion is measured nowhere. So we have these measurement incentives for providers to use coercion to meet their uptake targets. With this measure, a coerced IUD would fall into cell B. And so it would no longer be counting towards the good outcome. It would now look like a failure as opposed to a success. And we're hoping that this would really change some of those structural incentives that we were talking about earlier for coercion. The long-term vision of this project is to develop this indicator to be measured around the world, wherever there's a family planning program in place. And routine measurement is really the key to that. So the goal is to develop a really concise module of questions that can be added onto pre-existing population-based surveys around the world. So in the Global South, that would be the demographic and health surveys. Here in the US, that might be the National Survey of Family Growth, which is a survey that the CDC runs yearly. And this routine and repeated measurement would allow us now to compare between contexts. Okay, like, I don't know, like France has higher contraceptive autonomy than Belgium, or Wisconsin has lower contraceptive autonomy than Illinois, right? And so then we can start comparing things both between contexts and also looking at trends over time. Wisconsin has higher contraceptive autonomy today than it did a year ago, or vice versa. So that institutionalization and making this measurement routine is really key to its success. And I'll just conclude very briefly here with what I hope we can take away from this research. This contraceptive autonomy study helps to conceptualize coercion and autonomy. It situates these phenomena as part of a racialized, gendered, and politically contested development initiative. Our study finds that a range of coercive practices, from the subtle to the overt, can be found even in model family planning programs when those programs are motivated by contraceptive uptake targets. And we find that new modes of measurement can help promote new ways for programs to provide person-centered care. Our results argue for a decolonial and for a justice-based approach to global reproductive health that strips the power away from philanthrocapitalists and governments in the global north, and instead resituates the locus of power and decision-making within the communities that are affected by these types of policies. And finally, we need to develop a new range of measures that center the voices of contraceptive users and their own desires for their bodies and for their lives. And then I would just be remiss here if I didn't close by circling back to the reproductive justice framework and highlighting this framework as really a lodestar for global family planning moving forward. The reproductive justice framework really gives us such a useful understanding of how we can situate the fight for reproductive freedom as part of a broader struggle for social justice, intersecting with things like environmental justice, racial justice, disability justice, and so many other social movements. So with that, I would like to gratefully acknowledge the funders of this project, and then thank you all very much for listening.
You used the term global north.
Yes.
Yes.
Define those terms.
Yes, there's a lot of contestation around this. How do you make the distinction between countries that have been called at various times first world versus third world, developed versus underdeveloped, high income versus low income? There's a lot of contestation around that, what the best terms are. And I could spend an hour on this. A lot of people think that we shouldn't even, like, what does Thailand have to do with Bolivia? Like, why even bother looping these countries together in a category as well? The terms global north and global south are, at the moment, I think, the most widely accepted terms to describe this gulf between the what at one point was called sort of the global metropole, or like the center of global empire, versus the countries that were the former colonies. And so there are terms that are used to sort of delineate where global power rests. But folks really contest it. Folks don't like, for example, that Australia is considered part of the global north. There's a lot of contestation about it, but it's really a sort of a term to describe the most powerful countries in the world versus the countries with the least power. Oh, sorry, we were going to go over here next?
Go ahead there.
Oh, okay.
Preferences, do they change over time, and then how do you take account for that?
Sorry, do what change over time?
Preferences. So
Preferences.
So one's preferences may change from
Sure.
over time.
Sure.
And then how does that affect your model?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not a longitudinal measure, it's a cross-sectional measure. So it's what we would call a point prevalence. So it's just measuring what's going on with you today. If today you have a method that you don't want, that's what we're measuring. If tomorrow your preferences change, we'd hope that we'd catch that on the next survey. But it's just sort of, think about it more as a snapshot than it is something that's tracking people over time. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, a concern that I have, some people think that I'm somewhat radical in my
Me too.
viewpoint, is that I'm concerned by environmental groups, anytime they consider the whole issue
Yep.
of environmental problems, resource depletion,
Yep.
air and water pollution, they seem to somehow believe that we can totally divorce those considerations from population increase. And I've had some experiences where I've been appalled by some of the irresponsible statements that I've heard by persons who should know much better on the subject. For example, I attended some discussion group, a Zoom forum sponsored by the UCC Church. And when I raised the question about population and how that impacts on other aspects of the environmental scenario, this woman who was an ordained UCC minister told me that told me that overpopulation is a total myth. Fortunately for her, I refrained from expressing my opinion of her remark. I was almost ready to tell her that from a clergy person, that was about the most professionally irresponsible remark that I ever hoped to hear from an ordained minister. I refrained from saying that, but I could not help but being completely appalled. And I often find this similar response whenever I raise the question about population. I'm told that that's a racist subject or it's sexist to even mention anything about population in conjunction with environmental degradation. I'm just wondering, what is your viewpoint on that, the fact that the topic is considered so taboo to bring up, even among people that I would have expected to have the necessary intelligence and education to be concerned about it. Thanks.
Well, I hope, I have some bad news for you, which is I think I'm going to appall you right now. I hope you think I have the necessary education and intelligence. I have a PhD from Harvard. I spent a lot of time studying this, and I wouldn't go so far as to say overpopulation is a myth, because I don't necessarily think that that's a helpful framing. But I do think that blaming population growth for climate change and the other environmental catastrophes in which we find ourselves today, blaming those things on the reproductive organs of Black and brown women living in the global South really is fundamentally racist and sexist. So I'm sorry to confirm your worst suspicions of me and my orientation towards this. But I mean, we can think about, like, I just gave this talk in London a couple days ago. Like a week ago, I was in London giving this talk. And I flew to London and I flew back. And I'll fly more this year and I'll fly back. And like, I buy a lot of toys for my dog that he doesn't play with. And I consume a lot. Like, I consume a lot. When I go to Burkina Faso or Niger or these other countries in the Sahel where their fertility rates are still maybe 5, 6, or 7, in 20 lifetimes, their 7 children won't consume what I'm consuming. And I think it's really irresponsible. First of all, they didn't contribute to creating climate change. They didn't contribute, their consumption is not contributing to declining biodiversity. They're not causing the problem. I'm causing the problem, and I'll go as far to accuse all of us here in this room, the consumption of those of us in the global north, we are the problem. And so how fundamentally unfair is it for us to say, well, like, I want to keep buying toys for my dog, so you should have fewer kids. Their children are not the problem. I think it makes intuitive sense to us to think like, oh my gosh, the world is finite and eventually we're going to run out of space. I think that there's like a really intuitive logic to that makes sense to a lot of us. But the capacity for human adaptation is something that has been really overlooked in this discussion. I mean, I could spend another several hours here. There's this concept called intensification, which is that more people on Earth is not just more mouths to feed. It's more minds to think, it's more hands to work, it's more creativity, it's more ingenuity. And so I think that it's not to deny, certainly not to deny, that overconsumption is leading to a climate catastrophe that needs to be addressed. But I think singling out the supposed, like, quote unquote, high fertility of folks in the global South as either the root cause or the solution to that is grounded in sort of a racist idea. And I just don't think that we should be sort of like trying to turn women's bodies like control knobs to try to engineer the types of outcomes that we want to see in the world, but instead look to our own behavior and see how we can address the root causes of these phenomena. So I hope I didn't appall you too much with that answer.
Yeah, we have one on Zoom. How do you guard against the coercion being on the part of the husband or partner and not on the part of the provider? That's
a really good question. I get this question almost every time I present this. The sort of simple answer is, with this measurement, I don't. I'm not trying. It's a really important issue, but one measure can't do everything. So there are measures of reproductive autonomy that focus much more on reproductive coercion as something that stems from the intimate partnership, framing reproductive coercion as a form of intimate partner violence. And there's lots of work on that. lots and lots of researchers are working on that all over the world, both here in the US and in the global south. So I'm very happy to leave that to the folks who are specialists in it. And the focus of this is on health systems issues, which are much more intervenable, right? Like, it's really hard to go into someone's relationship and change those dynamics of how a husband and a wife relate to each other. That maybe isn't even from a health systems perspective, it's much easier to change how the health systems operate than it is to go into someone's intimate partnership. So it's an important issue, but it's not necessarily the subject of this research. Thank you.
I think you may have already answered it, but one of the things when you were listing all the criteria is there was no measure of how much resources these children use, and that seems to be an important factor. As you mentioned, the people who are poor from poor countries certainly use far less resources than we Americans do. I mean, Americans use at least 25% of all the resources in the world every year.
Yep.
And so having less population in the United States would go to a substantial improvement in our environment if we didn't produce so much.
I think that it's an important point. I agree with you that we really do need to be sort of looking inward, but I don't think that controlling the population within the US is the answer either. I'm gonna push back against any solution that uses, like I said, controlling the reproductive organs of women, using them like a control knob to try to get to the social outcomes that we want. We already don't have super high fertility in the US. There are a lot of debates about sort of like, so China's population is declining for the first time, and there's a panic about that because who's going to work and who's going to support the elderly, and people are worried about population collapse. There's a lot of worries about like how can we engineer the optimal society by trying to get women to have more babies or fewer babies, or there's just a lot of concern about that, and I would urge us all to move on. Let's think about other solutions to these problems that are less about controlling women's sexual and reproductive behaviors and more about finding policy solutions to some of the issues that we are most concerned about.
It's all very hypothetical, but take out, like, you burned up 4 tons of CO2 flying back and forth, and you could have done it by Zoom.
I could have.
A woman who had 10 babies.
Yep.
Do you think she did her society a service by doing that?
I'm not concerned about whether or not she's doing her society a service. I'm concerned about,
Coercion.
yes.
You're not talking about social responsibility, and that's like,
I don't think that we have any business going to someone in Niger and telling her what her social responsibility is. I'm really going to push back quite strongly about that. And any idea that we know better than she does, what's better for her and her family, again, I think is really steeped in colonial thinking.
so that's another political term. And you also use the term, sound rather definitely have a political bias here. And it shows.
Okay, great.
And it
Yeah.
doesn't sit well with many people.
I'm thankful that you're sharing your thoughts with me. Thanks. There was a question back here.
About coercion, subtle.
Uh-huh.
So if I were to ask you for your diet whether you should eat 15% saturated fat or 40% mainly monounsaturated, polyunsaturates, or almost anybody in this room, would you be able to know what choice to make? So if you're presenting complex biological information to a person who doesn't have the background to understand, for example, you said 5-year versus 3 months. I have no idea what the method that you were talking about, and I'm fairly educated on that. So if I couldn't say, well, what are the benefits of 5 versus 3? What's the method? What's the mechanism? How could I choose?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a framework for this. It's called the Shared Decision-Making Framework. It's put forth by a scientist at UCSF named Christine Dellendorf, to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude. And it's based very much on this idea that certainly we need providers to help us understand. They come in with a lot more medical knowledge than we do. I haven't gone to medical school. I don't know about all of how the hormones interact with different comorbidities and those kinds of things. And so the idea is that with shared decision-making is that each person is coming into the contraceptive counseling encounter with their own set of expertise. The provider is coming in with a great deal of expertise about sort of the medical side of things, but no understanding of what the person's background, history, preferences, desires for the future, any of that. The person seeking contraception is coming into the encounter with their full knowledge of what I want, what I need, what my hopes are for the future, what didn't work for me the last time, but not as much knowledge about the scientific side of things. And so the idea with shared decision-making is they meet in this clinical encounter, each one shares their expertise with the other, and the final decision rests with the person whose body is going to be affected by the contraception.
I'm very skeptical because we try to get people to eat well or exercise more in the United States. We give them all a bunch of information and it just doesn't work. So
Well, I'm
we can
concerned that
table
you
it.
seem to be treating fertility as it's some sort of illness that needs to be prevented.
It's not an illness, no, it's
Yeah.
a biological choice.
Yeah,
But if they don't have
exactly.
the information to make that choice, they're in the same boat as somebody who might opt for a different diet or no activity or whatever. So it's a continuum, it's not either or.
Yeah,
So
I agree,
also have to
spectrum,
put
yeah,
back-
there's a spectrum of coercion.
I also
Yeah.
agree with some of the comments here. 10 babies are going to require food that we have to produce everywhere in the world.
Yep.
And that agriculture is going to increase CO2. 70% of our problems is agriculture-based. So educating, and the WHO has a very big emphasis on that, educating girls, adolescent girls, about choice, about health, is the best way to control population, regardless of where you are. It doesn't have to be the global south. It could be the global north. But that is a routine, accepted practice across the world. It has nothing to do with coercion. It has to do with education.
So, sorry, what's the question?
So it isn't a question, it's more of a statement. But
Okay.
I'm pushing back on the fact that our attitudes about population control are just about controlling individuals in the global south, of brown and black. And I don't believe that the overall mission and emphasis on global population health is on that control in a racial attitude. It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with the total global population. So, your comments, I guess, that's the question.
Let's see. I mean, I take your point about we do this in the global north too. We absolutely have sort of stratified, racialized, stratified reproduction along racial and ethnic lines, certainly here in the US as well. So I agree with you that we're controlling certain people's bodies here in the US. It's not the wealthy, white, well-educated people whose bodies we're controlling. There's a very, very, very well-documented history of, like I said, eugenics and controlling the bodies of black and brown women here in the US. So I think we really need to think critically about whose bodies are targeting and why we think it's okay to target those bodies. I'll leave it there.
I guess I'm kind of interested in what percentage of people, like, is this actually a big problem? Like, I know there's a lot of good anecdotes about it.
Yeah.
But is it 90% of people who are getting contraception don't want it?
Yep.
So is it really, really rejected in most of these places?
That's a
or-
great question. My answer is we don't know yet, which is why I'm trying to create this new measure. None of our current measures get to
we know
that.
the first question, even like if people
Which one?
Are people even interested in getting contraception?
Sure, of course, yeah.
So if they are, then that means that there's
Well, when you say people, do you mean all people or some people?
I'm just talking about in these countries that you're talking about right now. Are people interested in it, or like are we just like forcing people to get it who don't want it, whereas we could be just working with people who do want it and we'd be fine, or is it?
When you say we'd be fine, what do you mean?
I mean, we'd be fine in that we wouldn't be doing
Yeah,
heavy
yes,
coercion,
yes.
and there's enough. Our aid could be still used.
Yes.
Or,
So let me go back to this idea of like the bi-directional nature of coercion. Upward coercion is people on whom we're foisting methods who don't want them. Downward coercion is people who want a method who are denied that method. These are both serious types of coercion. Neither one is sort of more
I guess
serious than the
I
other.
would love to know that yes, no percentage.
I'd love to, I hope we can measure it. That's my whole jam. You've hit the nail on the head, is I would also love to know this, yeah.
And then I'd say, like, I'm totally on board about the coercion, like forcing people to get contraception is a terrible thing to do, or forcing them not to have it. But I do think that, there's a lot of pressures like religion and
Yes.
family structure and, history, myth,
Yep.
that also try to convince people to do things that are not the best thing for them necessarily. And I think, if you have good data showing that, hey, having smaller families is better, isn't it fair to try to teach that?
Do we have data showing small families are better?
Well, I think you showed a bunch of things at the beginning that showed the different outcomes for having different.
Those are rationales that show why people care about family planning. I'm not necessarily
But you
showing
showed
there's
all
good
that
evidence
data.
for them.
I mean, that was all pretty convincing, I thought, but
Let's see, which one are you talking about?
all the stuff from the beginning with all the different.
Let's go back. Sorry, I have a lot of slides here. So here's the beginning. These are the diverse rationales that folks have, but I'm not showing any evidence here. This one?
There's evidence there, I think.
There's no evidence, there's just claims here, but they're not showing any evidence.
Maybe the next slide.
So these are the next slides.
Well, I mean, I feel like there is some reason to think that having 10 children, if you don't have enough money to feed the children you have, is probably not always going to be the best thing. That's her choice. I would never, try to force anybody to do something differently. But it would not be a terrible idea. So if you thought about that you might. Some people don't have that many children, and they can spend the money on helping the children that they do have. But I just think that there's an education component that is not a terrible thing.
Sure. I mean, you'll never see me arguing against education and expanding I hope it goes without saying, but I'll say it now. I'm pro family planning. Like, I like family planning. I want to expand access to family planning around the world. I think contraception is a transformative force for good when people choose it. So on that, we are 100% agreed. Everyone who wants it should have it. The issue is when we're, again, trying to solve these like societal problems by treating women's bodies as if they're sort of an instrument to get to those solutions. And it's not just anybody. We're not targeting men for vasectomy. That's one thing to think through. We're not targeting men for vasectomy or any other form of birth control for men. We're not targeting the wealthy of the world, the elites of the world. We're targeting the poorest of the poor, who had played essentially no role in creating the problems that we're trying to solve. Issues around sort of like food scarcity and those kinds of things, I think, have extremely little evidence behind them. We create vastly more food right now than we have people to feed. Food waste is a substantial problem, but we do not have a food shortage. In modern history, there has been no famine that was caused by a shortage of food, but rather an inequitable distribution of food. So we absolutely have problems on our planet of overconsumptions, poverty, inequities, unequal distribution of resources. These are serious problems. Why we're so focused on population control as a solution to these is what I'm arguing is rooted in these racist and colonial narratives.
Sorry, I didn't hear what the last sentence.
Rooted in racist and colonial narratives.
Racism and
Racist and colonial
And you
narratives.
said this is not a political point you're making?
Oh, I didn't say that.
No. In fact, you affirmed that you just did.
Yes, science is very political. You would never hear me denying that science is political. Yes, yes.
Well, you've done an excellent job of defining the wicked problem. I guess I'd like to look at it from a boundary condition point of view.
From a what point of view? I'm so sorry.
Boundary condition,
Okay.
and looking at macro and micro view of whether public health or individual health. Since it's such a wicked problem, isn't there conflicts between public health and individual health?
I'm not sure there are any public health issues that we need to solve by coercing people into using contraception that they don't want. I'm not, like I said, I have a PhD in public health and with a focus on sexual and reproductive health, and I'm not aware of any conditions like that. Do you have anything in mind?
No, just I guess this overall of macro and micro view of your paradigm, from totally individual to societal advantage for individual people.
Yeah, I guess.
For an example of vaccination.
Uh-huh.
I mean, so that we have a community gain by people getting vaccinated, and so individually, how does that affect your thinking just a little bit? I mean, I'm not talking about coercion or not coercion, but there has to be some conflicts between individual practice of individual health versus the public health in population.
I can think of a very clear public health rationale why I should get vaccinated to protect you. We're getting vaccinated against transmissible diseases, and I can infect you with my disease if I don't get vaccinated. I can't think of a way that sort of fertility, which is one of the most sort of fundamental parts of the human experience, is equivalent to that. And I can't think of any public health problems that we would solve by restricting someone's fertility in ways that they don't want. And rather, you know, someone was mentioning the WHO, the UN, there's decades of human rights law that affirm that everyone has the right to have the number of children that they would like, and that it is a fundamental violation of human rights to restrict that. So I'm just not sure like what public health outcome you think we would be able to improve by forcing someone to use contraception they don't want. Sorry? Yeah, I'm happy to talk more. I mean, there are some folks who would argue that maternal mortality would decrease if folks use contraception more, and like certainly there's sort of an indisputable logic there where if you never get pregnant, you can't have a maternal, like by definition, you can't die a maternal death if you never get pregnant. So there are some folks who would argue that we could reduce maternal mortality, for example, if we reduce the number of pregnancies that there were. But I think by that logic, then if we take it sort of to its logical conclusion, the way to eliminate maternal mortality is then to eliminate pregnancy, which I think none of us would argue for. And there are certainly more equitable ways to address maternal mortality that still allow people to have their desired families and respect their reproductive rights while still allowing them to have the number of children that they'd like.
When you mentioned that one of the women had 10 kids, and I don't know the society they come from, nonetheless, maybe 10 kids is what they need to survive, and so making a decision that that's too many seems to be very subjective, because I don't know, I don't think anyone knows what that society is like and whether 10 is enough.
I appreciate that. I mean, the idea that we can decide for anyone else, I think is, right, like even if we know what society they're from, we don't know what their family is going through, we don't know anything about them. And we really have to respect each person's fundamental rights to make those decisions for themselves.
And we'll get the microphone to you, Jeff. Let's do this first, and then
Okay.
get the microphone.
Thanks. I guess another, I think, very fundamental question about population and consumption of resources, like you pointed out correctly, is tied to economic prowess and resources. For example, in Germany, between 1929 and 1933, there was no crop failure of any particular extent. Agricultural production remained pretty constant, but people found themselves unable to afford to buy food because of external economic happenings. And I think we know pretty well what happened in Germany between 1929 and 1933. And no, I don't think it's because Germans are inherently more evil than any other group of people or inherently more desirous of military prowess. I think we know pretty well what brought a certain political party to power. And my concern in this country is that as long as we have people that have certain level of guaranteed income, as long as a radiologist or a dentist is guaranteed a salary of $500,000 a year, a few years out of professional school, as long as we have people that can afford a 10,000 square foot home, or a Hummer vehicle at $50,000. As long as people can squander their resources in those ways, we are not going to be able to solve the problem that
Yeah.
you've identified
Yeah.
as resource consumption. And my answer, the only one that I really have, is we have to find a way of getting the money out of the wrong hands and into the right hands. And I don't have any easy solution to offer tonight, but I am a firm believer that radical economic reform, economic distribution of income, assets, and resources is what has to be pursued. I don't have any overnight solution for that because it's a subject that makes people too scared when I start talking about it, but that is what we have to look at, among other things. I fully agree with you that
Yeah.
the problem is not too many persons in Mali are importing
Yeah.
too much Fiji spring water to
Yeah.
drink.
Yeah.
That's not the problem.
Yes.
It's- oh,
I couldn't.
Okay, thanks.
Here you will not be appalled. I couldn't agree with you more strongly. Actually, I have an anecdote. I was working in Burkina Faso a few years ago, and like I said, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is this very big donor of family planning. Melinda Gates has made it sort of her signature initiative to support family planning for all of the reasons that we've talked about. And Melinda was going to do a site visit in Burkina Faso while I was there. And I was sort of at one of the sites that she was visiting. And everyone was all a Twitter and a buzz. Everyone was very, very excited. I learned on that trip that not only did a huge sort of like retinue of folks from the Gates Foundation fly over on commercial flights for this visit, but Melinda flew her private jet over. And what I thought was particularly amusing about this was she didn't let any of the other staffers from the Gates Foundation fly over with her. They had to fly on a separate plane, and she flew on her private plane. And so I couldn't agree with you any more strongly that I guess I would tell that anecdote to point out what I feel is some pretty deep hypocrisy around flying to Burkina Faso to try to solve the climate crisis by promoting family planning in that and trying to reduce fertility in that country. So I think I couldn't agree with you more that it's the wild overconsumption of the global elite that we really need to sort of tackle as the main problem here.
I'm not going to ask you about 10 kids or anything.
Okay.
But my question is, you brought this up, is really, we have this South Global we've identified. What, the dollars are a measurement. So how many of these are like homegrown plans within these countries versus, is the problem there? I mean, they're getting money.
Yeah.
And these things are bleeding through somehow.
Yep.
It's not, I don't think we have a directive enough to just say, oh, we need to have it this way. How is that the problem, too, of just each of these countries, and you can see with China itself,
Yep.
how they
Yes.
approach that,
Yes.
their logic and everything.
This is a great question, and it's a very thoughtful question and a deep question that is extremely hard to answer. I'm going to try to answer it, but it's a really tricky question. I mean, the idea that we can sort of try to disentangle what is sort of authentically theirs versus what is a Western or a Northern imposition, it's something that I both try to do in my thinking and also know is not possible or perhaps not even helpful. One of the issues is that this sort of what we call Malthusian thinking, this population control thinking, has been so dominant for so long that how do we then disentangle what is authentically theirs versus what is imposed by us? So a lot of people attribute the founding of, or one of the the instigator of this most recent round of neo-Malthusian thought to a paper by Cole and Hoover from, I believe, 1958, but don't quote me on that, on economic growth in India. And they posited in 1958, just as sort of India had achieved independence, that high population growth in India would be a barrier to economic development there. And then right around 1958, that's right preceding the time when most of these fledgling African republics gained their independence from their colonial powers too. And so there was this really powerful economic way of thinking that said, if these countries want to establish themselves as new independent countries, grow their economies and escape from poverty, they needed to keep their population growth contained, or else the population growth would be a barrier to economic growth. So now we're 70 years later? Can we disentangle sort of like what is coming authentically from the ground up versus what's coming from that Cole Hoover paper versus what's coming from the rhetoric that we're doing now? It's really hard to disentangle. What I can say is that it's really clear, for example, that, let's see here. This program, this FP 2020 program, is a top-down program. It's coming from the top. And actually, to their credit, it was called FP 2020. Then in 2020, they re-upped it to now it's FP 2030. And in response to a lot of the criticism, they've made a tremendous effort now to, instead of being based in the US, they now have different headquarters in different parts of the Global South, and they're trying to decentralize, and they're trying to, I guess what some might cynically say is pay lip service, more sincerely would say make a serious effort to try to make this less of a top-down program. But it's really challenging when the funding is coming from one family foundation or from USAID, from our government, or from these donors that are based in the global north. For me, the people who are holding the wallet, that's really the locus of power. So
That's the biggest share. I mean, I'd be really interested in the ones that fund it themselves.
yeah,
They fund it themselves on this because they've identified it in some way as something that they're solving. And, just like we elect people or we choose people,
Yep.
sometimes that doesn't happen in
Yep.
some place, but they're making a decision to do that, and then the police superintendent, how much, is there money spent, like, we have no control over it, it's just gonna happen?
It's hard to generalize for the entire world, right? It's hard to generalize for the entire world because each country has its own thing going on. And even within countries, there's contestation. I think probably most would agree, like, no one imposed the one-child policy on China. They chose that. That came from within China. Does that mean the people of China chose it? Then we have to get into like the the internal politics of different countries to understand the extent to which the elite of the country is making decisions for everyone else. In India, if we look at the history of population control in India, which is another sort of country that stands out for its population control program, the Ford Foundation was actually quite instrumental in the first family planning programs in India. So I would say it's really historically dependent, and we would need to sort of do a much, much deeper dive into a specific locale as opposed to making sort of global generalizations.
Is there any significant way that this global health issue can be related on a more local level? Could contraception coercion be a widespread issue within the local healthcare systems too?
Like here in Madison? I guess
They didn't specify, but local healthcare, so sure.
I haven't done any research here in Madison. I do not know the answer, and I would sort of hesitate to guess. There is a lot of research from the United States showing racial bias, ethnic bias, and those kinds of things in the provision of contraception here in the US. So I would say, yes, we have that here. The extent to which it's manifesting to a large degree in Madison is something that I cannot speculate about. I don't know if do we need a mic?
Question.
Oh, okay.
Many women are serving in the World Health Organization, and many are leading politicians in the global north and global south. Why don't they fight for women's reproductive rights?
Oh, that's a good question. One thing I would say is, just because we have women in power doesn't mean they're necessarily doing the feminist thing. We certainly have internalized misogyny within ourselves that we need to deal with. I think a lot of people are fighting for reproductive rights, but if we take this example of like Melinda Gates, people have complex identities. So yes, she's a woman, but she's also a white woman from the global north who's part of this global elite, who's extremely wealthy and has a lot of concentration of power. So like, to what extent can she stand in solidarity with poor black women from Niger? I mean, there's one axis of sort of unity there, but many, many axes of differences. So a lot of feminists from the global South have problematized this idea that there can be some sort of global sisterhood where the category of woman supersedes all of the things that divide us. So people are complex, and that's why keeping an intersectional lens, taking an intersectional approach to feminism is really key.
I was glad to hear that voice from a person on the internet, because I am struck by how few women's voices are in this discussion and how much all of the world's issues, problems, seem to be being blamed on women's reproduction.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I don't have anything to add to that. I think that's an excellent point. That it's like, oh, how convenient that all of the world's problems can be solved by just having these certain types of women have fewer babies. And if their pesky uteruses would just stop uterusing, we could solve all of our problems. Yes.
Was that a verb?
I just coined it. You can quote me on
Can you give us
it.
examples of bottom-up, were worked up from the bottom up? I can think of Cuba, their health system there. Like, how are they doing it differently in countries that are more innovative?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I actually don't know much about Cuba's family planning program. I think in part because it is so marginalized from like the broader global health discussion. That's a great question. I would love to sort of look into that and find out more about it. It's a good question. That's all I'll say. I would love to learn more about these countries that have eschewed Western or Northern influence to see what their family planning programs look like.
There's one more on Zoom. How do religious healthcare systems, example Catholic in Wisconsin, relate to reproductive coercion?
That's a great question. Great question. We're doing a lot of work here at the UW. I'm affiliated with a research center on campus called the Collaborative for Reproductive Equity, which all of you should know about. It's a wonderful research center here on campus. And I haven't personally been involved in this research, so I don't want to misrepresent it. But my colleagues at CORE have been involved in a lot of work showing how people who deliver at Catholic hospitals here in Wisconsin are not able to access the postpartum contraceptive options that they want. So for example, if they want, like it's much easier if someone wants to get a tubal ligation and they're getting a C-section, it's much easier to do that all in one surgery than it is to do the C-section, close up, wait for it to heal, then go back in and do a tubal ligation. So it's much easier to sort of combine those into one procedure. But the research has shown that people who are delivering at Catholic hospitals are being denied that postpartum tubal ligation that they're looking for, and many other contraceptive options. They're being denied. Prior to the Dobbs decision, they were being denied access to safe and legal abortions. And so this idea of hospitals, the religious ideology of a given health center being able to dictate the type of care that's being offered is a tremendous barrier to reproductive autonomy. And I really appreciate the question.
It's a barrier to reproductive training of doctors
Yes.
who do residencies in those hospitals.
That too, absolutely.
Really tough question. How badly are the Eagles going to beat Kansas City?
If you ask me about the Phillies or any other Phillies sports team, I can get really excited about it, but I've actually never been able to get that excited about the Eagles. It's like the one civic thing I've never been able to get into.
Wow, thank you. I'm just going to stand here and deflate. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Could
I'm
you fake
sorry.
it for a while and just say,
Well,
yeah?
we're having a great sports. I mean, the Phillies were the National League champs,
Yes.
and now the Eagles
Yeah.
are the NFC champs, and it's like it's a good time to be a Phillies sports fan. Also, I'm Argentine, and we won the World Cup. I'm having a great year. I really am.
Wow. Thank you very much. This is great. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.